right, everybody. So now we're going to take a look at question number 4 on the practice with aggregate demand, aggregate supply handout. This is what the front of it looks like, in case you forget. We're going to do number 4 together to see how we're doing with the new skill of working with long-run aggregate supply. So the question says, assume that the United States is operating below full employment. Remember, I told you that the first statement in these FRQs is often very, very important because it tells us which of the 3 places we're going to be. So this one says we're operating below full employment. So that's another way of saying that we're operating with a recessionary gap. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the long-run supply, short-run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand, and show each of the following. The current equilibrium output and price level labeled as Y1 and PL1, and the full employment labeled as YF. So I'm going to use the bottom of this piece of paper here. I'm going to draw my long-run aggregate supply, price level, real GDP. I need to show these lines intersecting over here. And the short-run equilibrium, we can see that we're not operating up to full employment, right? So the long-run aggregate supply is to the right of the short-run equilibrium because we have a recession. You are going to get 2 points for that section. Remember, I told you, as long as you do the graphs correctly, you're going to get credit. So it's really important that you commit to memory, but also understand the 3 places to be. And you understand that operating below full employment, we can see that gap between where we are and where full employment is. 1 point for having the long-run aggregate supply in the correct location, 1 point for having everything else put together and labeled as they've asked. Policymakers pursue expansionary fiscal policy, so we should see taxing or spending happening because that's what fiscal policy is. If we want to expand the economy, we want people to have more disposable income to spend. Assume that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and the value of the recessionary gap is 300 billion. There it is. Remember, I told you you're going to get MPCs usually of 0.75, 0.8, or 0.9, and lo and behold, we've got a 0.8. If the government changes its spending without changing taxes to eliminate the recessionary gap, calculate the minimum required change in government spending. So we're given the gap, 300 billion will equal the spending multiplier times the change in spending. So the spending multiplier, again, is going to be 1 over the MPS. We're given the marginal propensity to consume. Remember, I told you you're often going to have to do 2 steps. So it's going to be 1 over 1 minus 0.8, 1 over 0.2, and that means the multiplier is going to be 5 because this is 2/10, and then multiplied by the reciprocal. So 5 times what change in spending equals 300 billion. If I divide by 5, I'm going to get 60 billion as the change in spending. So that's the answer to part 1 of section B. Part 2 says if the government changes taxes without changing government spending to eliminate the gap. So instead of doing spending, we're going to do taxing. Will the minimum required change in taxes be greater than, smaller than, or equal to the required change in government spending as explained or identified in part B explained? So if $60 billion of spending is going to close the gap of 300 billion, and we know that people save a portion of their income, we would actually have to tax more than $60 billion in order to achieve a $300 billion gap. So the minimum change in taxes would have to be greater than 60 billion due to consumers' marginal propensity to save or that people will save a portion of their income. Now, remember, I also told you that you could explain this through the math. So you also could say greater than, and, you know, explain this above. Don't do the ... like I just did there, but I just want you to, like, in the interest of time. So if the spending multiplier is 5, then that means the taxing multiplier is -4. Remember that the spending multiplier plus the taxing multiplier equals 1. So 5 plus a -4 equals 1. So if we did increase taxes by 60 billion times a -4, this would only result in $240 billion in a change of GDP. So that clearly is not equal to 300 billion. So in order to get that $300 billion growth in GDP, we would have to tax more than 60 billion. And if you wanted to explain that through numbers, you absolutely can, or you could just explain because people will save a portion of their tax cut. Enjoy.